Diablo 4 just finished their Season 8 PTR campfire chat, and there was a lot to digest. We're going to break down all 24 seasonal powers, changes coming to popular rune words, brand new legendary aspects, as well as new looting changes that are being made to boss drops. We're over here on Wowhead, and they broke this down so nicely. I'm going to have this article and all of the rest of them in the description of this video if you guys want to check it out. It's a great source for all of your Diablo 4 needs. The way that this was broken down, we're going to have a brand new system. It's very similar to the way that you slot the new witch powers that we have in Season 7. There's going to be a main power as well as 3 different modifiers. How the bosses are going to work and how you get these powers, as you go kill all of these bosses, you unlock their powers. You basically steal them and then you can use them for yourself. It is a very cool theme. We'll have a main and it'll have a modifier. For the Wandering Death, the chest beam, it basically looks like you're fighting the world boss. You have this gigantic beam that just comes right out of you, and you can, wherever you aim it, you can shoot. So the modifier is Well Channeling, spawns a beam, deals 300 frost damage per second. Enemies hit take 50% increased damage from you for 1 second. So it's a great damage modifier while you're using it, and you just keep on channeling it while you're using your abilities. So that would be if you slot it into this slot right up here. If you were to use it as a modifier and put it into one of these 3 slots, your main boss power instantly executes non-boss enemies hit with less than 15% life. When you execute an enemy, you gain 25 primary resources. Now this seems really great for leveling. As soon as that enemy hits 15% life or more, if you do damage, so let's say that you have this one on as your main ability, and you hit them with your main ability, they are instantly executed and you gain 25 resources. Now as fast as we kill things, you basically can have unlimited resources as long as you're killing things with your new boss powers here. So now we're going to look at Ashava's Poisoned Breath. The main ability, hitting an enemy affected by damage over time, spawns a wave of acid that deals 400% poisoning damage over 4 seconds. Applies 10% more poison for each 1% of the target's life currently affected by the damage over time. So the more damage over time you have them, so if you're playing like one of the rogue builds now where poison is going to be what you're going to be focusing on because they're putting a really big emphasis on the traps and poison traps, this might be a good choice for you. As a modifier, once per activation, damaging an enemy with your main boss power applies 45% poisoning damage over 3 seconds. Now, these are going to scale with your Paragon levels, so they're going to actually be pretty powerful. So we'll get to see exactly how strong these are when we hit the PTR. Avarice's Explosive Ore. Main ability, when you gain excess primary resources, spawn a piece of ore. After 2.5 seconds, that piece of ore explodes, dealing 700% fire damage. You can spawn up to 3 pieces of ore at once. Using this as a modifier, activating your main boss power spends all of your primary resources and increases your damage by 1.5% per resources spent. That's really, really great. Especially for builds that are going to be able to regenerate their primary resources very quickly, this might be a huge increase to your damage. So those are all of the world boss powers that you're going to be able to steal when you kill the world bosses, so make sure you take the time to go and get all of them. Now we're going to hop into what's going to be the brand new seasonal mechanic. Going to have apparitions that are going to be appearing around the world. They're going to be in apparition incursions. Each of them are going to have the option of spawning 2 bosses out of a pool of 10. You want to make sure you make enough time to go to all of these and collect all 10 powers so that you can figure out what you're going to use that's going to be best for your builds. The first one is going to be Alex Talons. Your main ability, casting a basic skill, applies 200% sparkling damage over time for 4 seconds to enemies hit. Now, what that means, that's going to be the new terminology for any electric damage over time. So any of your lightning damage that does damage over time, it's now going to be called sparkling. The modifier here, gain 5% movement speed, increased by 0.5% for each 1% cooldown reduction you have, up to a maximum of 11%. So you're going to get a little bit more movement speed with this. The next one is going to be Beastmaster's Training. For the main ability, whenever you cast a summon skill or call a mercenary as a reinforcement, which is a kind of a cool little interaction, one of your summons or mercenary taunts the enemies and gains 40% damage reduction. As a modifier, your summons deal 5% more damage, increased by 0.25% for each of your critical strike damage bonus you have from items and from Paragon, up to a maximum of 17%. So this is going to be another way to increase some of your summoning damage, which is kind of cool. And remember, this is going to scale with your Paragon levels. Black Mailer's Sabotage. Your main ability, casting a core skill while you have a barrier, knocks down close enemies for 1.1 seconds. This can only occur on the same enemy more than once every 5 seconds. And the modifier, whenever you gain Fortify, additionally, you gain 20% of the amount as barrier. That's actually really cool interaction. Now, when you gain Fortify, which a lot of classes gain Fortify a lot, and if you are on a class that can't gain Fortify, you can use for here, you're going to also gain barrier. This is going to add just another layer of survivability to a lot of builds, and I can see this one being a pretty popular one. Flesh Reaper's Disruption. Your main ability, damaging an enemy, removes the vulnerable and then stuns them and the surrounding enemies for 0.5 seconds. This stun applies 100% more stagger to bosses. So if you're a class that needs to get that stagger on bosses, that's definitely going to be very helpful. Gain 5% vulnerable damage, increased by 0.25% for each 1% of crowd control duration bonus you have, up to a maximum of 10.5%. Hatred's Embraces Haste. Main, casting a shadow or fire skill grants 1.1% movement speed for 3 seconds up to 11%. As a modifier, gain 5 critical strike chance increased by 0.5 for each 1% shadow resistance you have, up to a maximum of 22.5%. So that is quite a bit of critical strike chance. There were a lot of people that were out there as soon as we got the release of this saying that Sorks may have a hard time capping out on critical strike chance because the new unique is going to be in the helmet slot, no more Air of Perdition, but that is a lot of critical strike chance. That's about half of what you can get from Air of the Perdition, maybe a little bit less. So that's going to be a different way and a unique way to maybe get that critical strike chance filled in for you. Irma's Spark. Your main ability, when you evade, apply 200% sparkling damage over time to close enemies. The modifier, your evade cooldown is reduced by 5%, increased by 0.25% for each of your lightning resistance from the bonuses that you have, up to 11%. So you're going to be able to reduce your evade cooldown pretty quickly with this. Outlaw's Sharpshooter's Eye. Your main ability, dealing direct damage to a distant enemy, slows them and the surrounding enemies by 40% for 5 seconds. As the modifier, you deal increased damage to enemies the further they are away from you, up to 10.5%. Signrat's Flames. Your main ability, using a mobility skill, burns close enemies for 200% burning damage over time. As a modifier, you gain 5% increased damage to all elements. As a modifier, and this is a mouthful, gain 5% increased damage to all elements. For each 1% of an element's resistance from bonuses, gain 0.2% increased damage for that element, up to a maximum of 15.5%. Screg's Toxins. Your main ability, when an enemy applies damage over time effect on you, you apply 1000% poisoning damage to them over 4 seconds. As a modifier, when you take damage from a damage over time effect, you have a 5% chance to be healed instead, increased by 50% of your poison resistance bonuses, up to a maximum of 12%. That's a very interesting interaction. Whenever damage over time hits you, you have a chance to be healed instead of taking damage, and that can go up to a 12% chance. Seems like it might be kind of fun to mess around with. Orac's Rage. Your main ability, damaging a crowd-controlled enemy, makes them and surrounding enemies unstoppable, but you gain 10.5% increased damage, attack speed, and movement speed for 3 seconds. As a modifier, you gain 5% increased attack speed, increased by 0.25% for each 1% to damage the crowd-controlled enemies you have, up to a maximum of 10.5%. So all of those boss powers that we just covered, you can do those at any point in the game, all the way from normal up to Torment 4. For the next powers that we're going to cover, these can only be done in Torment 1 or higher, but they can all be done in Torment once. You do not have to get to Torment 4 in order to make it and get these boss powers. The first one we're going to go over is Belial's Crystal Decoy. These can be obtained by defeating Belial's in a lair boss ambush. What that means is when we're fighting bosses this season, we're going to have a chance to have an ambush. You kill the boss, and you're going to see a spawn happen. This crystal will pop out of the ground, and Belial, the baby Belial, as they put it, will come out. You kill that baby Belial, and then you're going to get that power. It also is going to double the amount of drops that you're going to get from the boss. For the main ability here, when you cast an agility, defensive, or macabre skill, spawn a crystal that taunts enemies and explodes after 3 seconds, dealing 600% shadow damage. As a modifier, activating your main boss power, fears nearby enemies for 0.7 seconds and deals 50% shadow damage to them. Now, I'm not a super big fan of fearing mechanics because everything runs away from you and you can't group things up and kill them, but we'll get to see how this goes. This very first main ability does seem like it's pretty good because a taunt is really, really great, especially for 3 seconds. Lilith's Wind of Hate. Now, for me, I absolutely love the Lilith fight. I know that is not a popular one, but this is you gain after defeating Lilith. Your main ability, when you cast a skill, attacks an enemy with a wave of spikes that lasts 2 seconds and deals 250% physical damage. Enemies take 60% increased damage from Wind of Hate each time it hits them, up to 300%. For the modifier, hitting an elite enemy with the main boss power creates an inert blister cone with 10% of their maximum life for 15 seconds. Killing the blister will remove 5.25 of the elite's life. An elite can have up to 3 blisters active at once, except for the world boss. I believe that this is going to affect normal bosses as well. So that means that when the blister is killed, you can do 15% of the boss's life at one time, just taken straight off. It looks like it might be pretty good. Duriel's Burrow. Now this one is really, really cool. They showed it in the live stream. Whenever you use an evade, you go underground, and then you can move yourself around, it does damage, and then you pop up out of the ground. Anytime that we get a seasonal power that transforms an ability, I absolutely love it. So what this does, for your main ability, when you evade, you now burrow underground, mobilizing surrounding enemies for 5 seconds, and dealing 200% on your entry and exit. You deal 200% damage every 0.25 seconds while burrowed. Evade's cooldown is increased by 4 seconds, and the cooldown reduction on evade is 50% effective. So that means that you won't be able to stack quite as much. Because this does so much damage, you won't be able to constantly evade with it. Modifier. Activating a main boss power grants you 25% increased dodge chance for 2 seconds. Whenever you dodge an attack, you immobilize nearby enemies for 3 seconds. Now we're going to go into Belial's Eye Beam. This is going to be after you defeat the Exalted Lair boss Belial. This is going to be the top of the boss tier, the new pinnacle boss, as people are calling it. What this does, your main attack, after you drink a healing potion, you gain 75% damage reduction for 2 seconds, and you summon an Eye Beam that corrupts enemies for 1,750 damage over 3 seconds. Corrupting is going to be the new damage over time for Shadow. That's just the lingo. Then your healing potion becomes disabled for 5 seconds. You may now drink your healing potion while at full life. Modifier. Activating your main boss power grants unbreakable stealth for 2 seconds. You deal 11% increased overpower damage while stealth. That means that sounds like you can attack while you're stealth. That sounds like a really, really cool ability to use, because if you pair that with the Shroud of False Death, now you are stealth for 2 seconds. When you pop out, you do additional damage. So this is pretty cool. You can go in and out of stealth that cannot be broken while you're in combat, and then you can gain that additional damage modifier from the Shroud of False Death. Andariel's Flaming Skull. You get this after defeating Andariel. For your main ability, after standing still for 1 second, summon a skull for 4 seconds that rotates around you and breathes fire that burns enemies for 1,200 damage over the 3 seconds that it's active for. That means that there's only a 1 second cooldown that you can't have this up. For the modifier, burning an enemy takes 21% more damage from your damage over time effects. For 5 seconds after activating your main boss power, all of your other attacks burn enemies for 1,800% damage over 3 seconds. Sounds like it's going to be a great ability for some of the Sorks out there. Feast in the Ice's Sleet. Your main ability, after casting 3 skills which apply crowd control or stagger effects, shoot out 3 sleet spikes that deal 800% increased cold damage and freeze enemies for 2 seconds. As a modifier, your main boss power now chills enemies it damages for 2.5%. Grégoire's Lightning Square. This was one they highlighted in the live video. Your main ability, after casting a core skill, lightning tiles outwards for 1.2 seconds, dealing 300% lightning damage per strike. As a modifier, once per activation, damaging an enemy with your main boss power stuns enemies it hits for 0.25 seconds. Lord Zir's Blood Pool. Your main ability, after damaging an enemy, spawns a pool of blood that deals 400% bleeding damage per second for 4 seconds. You can have up to 3 active pools. Your modifier, activating your main boss skill, heals you for 5.5% of your maximum life over 3 seconds. That's actually quite a big heal. That might be incredibly helpful. We'll have to see what it feels like on the PTR. Varshan's Lifesteal. Your main ability, each time you lose 25% of your maximum life, attach a leeching beam to an attacker which restores 10% of your maximum life, and it deals 1,200% corrupting damage over 3 seconds to them. As a modifier, activating your main boss power inflicts nearby enemies with 200% corrupting damage over 2 seconds. This is one of the brand new bosses, Urivar. This can only be done in Nahantu, so if you do not have the expansion pack, you will not be able to fight Urivar. However, he will have all of the same loot table as some of the other bosses, so you will not have any advantages or disadvantages. You can still get all of the same gear if you have the expansion pack or not. It's just a brand new cool fight that you're going to be able to do if you do have the expansion pack. For your main ability, after casting an ultimate skill, you're going to lob 4 bombs that deal 800% fire damage and reduce your ultimate skill's cooldown by 5 seconds. As a modifier, killing an enemy with your main boss power reduces the ultimate skill's cooldown by 0.2 seconds. Harbingers of Hatred's Volley. This is another one that you will need the expansion pack to fight. For your main ability, after damaging a vulnerable enemy, shoot piercing projectiles that last 1.3 seconds, dealing 400% increased fire damage and applying vulnerable. You deal 40% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. As a modifier, casting a basic skill while at maximum resources spends it all to make all nearby enemies vulnerable. Activating your main boss power grants 11% increased vulnerable damage over 5 seconds. So those are all the boss powers. I'm super excited to see what they feel like on the public test realm that's coming on Tuesday. Here is the changes to all of the rune words that are going to be happening. As part of the Diablo 4 season patch notes, some of the rune words are being adjusted and balanced, including reworks to Zan and the Cax rune. Notably, the Tech rune has gotten a large nerf, which affects nearly every Barbarian build that's out there. Now, we'll have to see how that feels on the Barbarian. I play Barbarian mostly. That has definitely been my main class since we started playing. While I was watching the live stream, I did happen to scribble down one of the notes that said, physicality, making Barb big bonks matter. So I believe that we're going to see that becoming a thing now. They're going to pull back on some of the scaling where you cast an ability and then it casts something else, and that's how Barbarians do damage. I think they want to bring back those big, gigantic bonks that are going to do a ton of damage. I'm very excited to see how it feels. I know that the Earthquakes have been a ton of fun. I think that they're still going to do a lot of damage, just not quite as much as they've been doing now. The Zan rune. Now what it's going to do. Your next attack will cause your hits to be guaranteed critical strike and overpower for 0.25 seconds. The overflow is being changed to 0.35% damage per offering. They're also going to be reducing the offering cost from 700 all the way down to 300. We're going to have to see how this feels, but this looks like a buff to me on paper. I don't know for sure. We're going to test it out when we hit the public test realm, but that seems really, really good. The Cax rune. Previously, your next non-basic skill spends all of your primary resources and deals up to 100% increased damage based on the percentage of resources spent. Now, casting a skill other than basic or defensive spends all your primary resources to increase your damage by up to 100% for 1 second. Again, this seems like another really, really great buff. The Vex rune, which was +1 to all skills for 10 seconds, and then the overflow was more ranks up to 3. They're reducing the offering cost, so you're actually going to be able to get more ranks much easier with this rune. The Lum rune, this is going to be getting an increase. You're going to gain maximum resources. Offerings gained increase from 2.5% to 3.5%. So this is going to be a buff here. The Ahu rune got a buff as well. Previously, the lucky hit chance 100% when hitting an injured enemy. What that meant is that you gained offerings when you hit an enemy that was in the injured state. The injured state is going to be below 35% life, and you had to proc a lucky hit in order to gain that offerings. Now, if you're fighting a whole bunch of monsters, you're going to miss out on 65% of the time you're not going to be gaining offerings. So what they've done is they've changed this. So now when you create a lucky hit, all of your abilities have a chance to create a lucky hit. When you do lucky hit, you have a 100% chance when hitting a non-healthy enemy to gain offerings. Offerings gained are reduced from 25 to 15 to compensate for that. But a non-healthy enemy is anybody below 80% life. So they're going to be definitely buffing this rune. You gain a little less offerings, but the range that you're going to be able to gain offerings is much, much bigger. The Tech rune is just getting a flat nerf. It's going from 1,400% damage down to 1,000%. Additionally, there were some bug fixes that hit certain runes. Fixed an issue where the Zal rune would play the heal sound effect when you were at full life. I was wondering what that was. Fixed an issue where swapping weapons could end the Jaw rune's teleporting buff. Fixed an issue where Nagu plus Se, which is actually what I'm playing on my companion Druid, would sometimes break if the target died right before the Spirit Wolves tried to do an ice explosion. That's really good to know, because there were some times where I would just have no wolves. That is exactly why. fix an issue where some of the text on the Q rune was displaying incorrectly in the font style. So those are all the changes to the runes that are coming up. The legendary powers that we got brand new ones for each class. The Barbarian one's going to be focusing around Mighty Throw. Mighty Throw and Steel Grasp now gain multiplicative damage instead of cooldown from cooldown reduction, and their damage is increased by another up to 250%. The Druids, Aspect of Impending Deluge, Storm Strike's damage is increased by 50%, and increases the damage the target takes from your other skills by up to 40% for 6 seconds. Necromancers, Aspect of Service and Sacrifice. Skeleton Warriors explode on death, dealing 200% physical damage to surrounding enemies. They lose 20% of their life while in combat. Skeletal Mages now take 90% reduced damage and deal up to 100% increased damage. Rogues, Aspect of Contamination. Poison traps burst for 250% poison damage when it's triggered. If this burst critically strikes, you deal up to 40% increased poison damage over 5 seconds. Sorcerers, Shivering Aspect. Enemies take up to 40% increased damage based on how much they are chilled or staggered. Apply 15% more chill. Spiritborn Aspect. Rip and Tear Aspect. Rushing Claw deals up to 300% increased damage, as empowered based on how many charges it has when it's cast. Heals 1% of your maximum life with 1 charge. Guaranteed Overpower with 2 charges. Guaranteed Critically Strikes with 3 charges, and will strike an additional time with 4+ charges. So those are all of the aspect changes, the runes, all of the boss powers, and then we're going to talk about some of the ways that we're going to be getting loot in the game. The boss ladder is changing, and so is the way that loot drops. How this is going to work. The first unique item that's dropped by a lair boss will be from their unique pool. Further items will have a 50% chance to be from the general pool. When you're playing in a party, a lair boss has a 33% chance per additional member to drop an extra unique item from the unique loot pool. Lair bosses now drop 5 unique items in Torment 4 instead of 6. That's all that I got to cover today. Now remember, this is all subject to change after the public test realm testing. This is not 100% locked in. We will definitely see major changes after all of the feedback comes in from the PTR. So don't take this to heart. Don't take this as concrete what is going to be happening in Season 8. Generally, after the public test realm happens and all of the final patch notes comes out, it is normally completely different. So the most important part is if you have a Battle.net PC, hop onto the PTR, do some testing for yourself, and then hit up the forums and give some feedback. The more feedback we get, the better a launch we get, because it's going to be super vital information. I'm live every night. I'd love it if you stopped by, said hi, theory crafted with me. Catch you on the clip side.